The sound of his hand hitting her face echoed through the entire courtroom like a gunshot. Every lawyer froze. Every reporter stopped breathing. And the man who had just done it, Daniel Whitmore, billionaire philanthropist, the most respected businessman in Chicago, straightened his tie and looked down at his wife like she was nothing, like she had always been nothing. If you have ever watched someone destroy another person in broad daylight and smile while doing it, you need to hear this story. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a house where love has turned into control. It is not the comfortable silence between two people who trust each other. It is not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning when both of you are reading and you don't need to speak because being together is enough. No, this silence is different. This silence has weight. It presses against your chest. It watches you from the corners of the room. It follows you from the kitchen to the hallway to the bedroom and never lets you forget you are being monitored. You are being evaluated. And one wrong word, one wrong expression, one moment of forgetting to smile correctly will cost you. Olivia Carter had lived inside that silence for 7 years. From the outside, her life looked like something most people could only dream about. She lived in a 4,200-square-foot home in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods north of Chicago. The kind of neighborhood where the hedges are perfectly trimmed and the driveways are long enough that you can't see the front door from the street. The kind of neighborhood where nobody asks questions because everyone has their own secrets they're too busy protecting. Olivia drove a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. She wore clothes that were selected, approved, and purchased by her husband. She attended charity galas and fundraising dinners twice a month and stood beside Daniel Whitmore while photographers took pictures and reporters wrote articles about what a beautiful couple they were. And she smiled. She always smiled, because she had learned the hard way what happened when she didn't. Her name before Daniel was Olivia Carter. But somewhere inside those 7 years of marriage, the Carter part of who she was began to quietly disappear. It didn't happen all at once. That was the thing about Daniel that nobody from the outside ever understood. He wasn't the kind of man who showed his cruelty immediately. He was patient, calculated. He understood that the most effective way to break a person is slowly, carefully, in pieces, so small, they barely notice what is being taken, until one morning they look in the mirror and they don't recognize the woman looking back at them. It started with small things. That dress makes you look like you're trying too hard. Wear the blue one. Your friends, sweetheart, I just don't think they bring out the best in you. Have you noticed how much you drink when you're around them? You don't need to work. Why would you want to work? I can give you everything, unless you don't trust me. Each sentence by itself sounded almost reasonable, almost caring. That was the genius of Daniel Whitmore. He wrapped his control inside words that sounded like love. He framed his manipulation as protection. He made Olivia believe that every time he took something from her, he was actually giving her something better. By year 3, she had no job. By year 4, she had no friends she still spoke to. By year 5, she had almost no contact with her family. And by year 6, she had stopped believing that any of this was wrong, because Daniel had convinced her slowly, methodically, the way water wears down stone, that everything wrong in her life was her own fault, that the loneliness was her sensitivity, that the isolation was her inability to appreciate what she had, that every time she felt unhappy, it was because something was broken inside her, not because of anything he had done. I gave you a life, he told her once in a calm voice while she sat at the kitchen table trying not to cry. Before me, Olivia, what did you have? A father who spent more time in a courtroom than with his own daughter. A dream of becoming a counselor that was never going to pay your bills. And a stubborn streak that would have ruined every relationship you ever tried to build. I took all of that, and I gave you something real. And you sit here acting like I've done something to you. She didn't answer. She had learned that answering only made it worse. But she was thinking. She was always thinking. That was the one part of herself Olivia had protected, even when everything else was being taken. Her mind, her memory, the small, quiet place inside her where she kept track of every single thing that had happened, every threat, every moment of fear. Every morning she woke up and felt like a prisoner inside her own home. She kept it all, like evidence. Like she was waiting for a moment she didn't fully believe would come. She thought about her father, Judge Michael Carter. She hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. The last real conversation they had was the one that ended everything. It was 3 weeks before her wedding. She had driven to his house, the same modest 2-story home in Evanston where she had grown up, where the bookshelves were full and the kitchen always smelled like coffee, and she found him sitting at his desk, papers spread in front of him, reading glasses pushed down his nose, looking exactly like the version of her father she had loved her entire childhood. He put the glasses on the desk when she walked in. He didn't smile. That was when she knew. "Dad, I need you to be happy for me," she said, standing in the doorway. "I need you to come to this wedding. I need you to stop saying things about Daniel that you cannot prove." Her father was quiet for a moment. He had the way of being quiet that judges develop over decades in courtrooms, the kind of silence that means he is choosing his words carefully because he understands the weight of language. "Sit down, Livy," he said. "I don't want to sit down. I want you to, please." She sat. He leaned forward in his chair, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at her the way he had looked at her when she was 8 years old and had done something she thought she had gotten away with but hadn't. "I have been on the bench for 22 years, he said. "I have sat across from people, good people, educated people, people who had every advantage in the world, and I have watched them be completely wrong about someone they trusted. I have read the cases, I have heard the testimony, and I have seen what happens when a person mistakes control for love. Daniel loves me," she said. "He's not like... He canceled your brunch with Sarah last month and told you it was because he made plans for the two of you. But there were no plans, Sarah told me. She called me because she was worried." Olivia's jaw tightened. "Sarah doesn't know what she's talking about." "He asked your boss to let you go. Olivia, he called your supervisor and said there were personal issues at home that required your full attention. You lost that job because of him." The blood drained from her face. She had believed she was laid off. Budget cuts. That was what she'd been told. "That's not," she started. "Some people," her father said, his voice low and careful, "do not love you. They love owning you. There is a difference. And the tragedy is that you cannot always see it from the inside." The silence that followed was long enough that a clock somewhere in the house ticked through it. Then Olivia stood up. "You have always done this," she said. Her voice was shaking, but not from sadness, from something harder. "You have always treated me like I can't make my own choices, like I need you standing over my shoulder telling me what's real and what isn't. Daniel told me you would do this." And those last words, "Daniel told me you would do this," were the words that told Michael Carter everything he needed to know. But by then, it was too late to stop it. Olivia walked out. She did not look back. She married Daniel Whitmore 3 weeks later in a ceremony her father did not attend, and the silence between them grew. 6 years of silence. 6 years of holidays where Michael Carter sat alone at a table that had too many empty chairs. 6 years of sending letters that weren't answered. 6 years of stopping himself from driving to that neighborhood north of Chicago because he had spent enough years on the bench to know that forcing yourself into someone's life when they haven't asked you back in, no matter how desperate the love behind it, can sometimes do more damage than staying away. So he stayed away. And he waited. And he prayed. The way fathers do when they have no other tools left. Inside the Whitmore house, Olivia's days had settled into a rhythm that felt less like a life and more like a performance she had to give every single day without rest. She woke when Daniel expected her to wake. She dressed in what he approved. She attended every event on a calendar she didn't control. She spoke to the people she was allowed to speak to. She smiled at the moments she was supposed to smile. And she endured. But then something shifted. It was not one big moment. That was the thing about Olivia. She was not saved by a single dramatic event that opened her eyes. Her awakening came the way winter finally gives way to spring, slowly, stubbornly, almost invisibly, until one day you look outside and realize something has changed, and you aren't entirely sure when it happened. It started with a woman named Rachel Morgan. Rachel was 31 years old, 5'3", wore her hair in a tight natural bun, and had a reputation in Chicago legal circles as someone who did not lose. She had never had a client who paid her particularly well. She specialized in domestic abuse cases and family law, which was not exactly where you went if you wanted to get rich. But Rachel Morgan had watched her own mother spend 11 years trying to leave a marriage that was slowly killing her, and she had decided at 22 years old in the front row of a courtroom, watching her mother finally be heard by a judge, that this was the work she was meant to do. Olivia found Rachel through a women's community forum she had been reading in secret on a phone she had purchased with cash at a drugstore 3 months earlier. She hadn't told Daniel she had it. She carried it in the lining of a coat she rarely wore, wrapped in a piece of fabric so it wouldn't rattle if the coat shifted. She had read the forum for weeks before she wrote anything. Then one night, while Daniel was at a business dinner and the house was quiet in the way she had come to hate that particular silence that felt like it was watching her, she typed a message. She didn't give her real name. She just wrote, "I think I'm ready, but I don't know how to do this safely." Within 4 hours, Rachel Morgan had responded. The first time they met in person was in the back corner of a coffee shop in a neighborhood on the south side of the city, far enough from Olivia's usual world that she felt confident no one who knew Daniel would see her there. Rachel arrived 5 minutes early, set a manila folder on the table, ordered 2 cups of coffee, and when Olivia slid into the chair across from her, Rachel didn't ask how she was doing. She didn't tell Olivia she was brave or strong. She didn't lead with anything emotional. She opened the folder and said, "Tell me everything, starting from the very beginning, and don't leave anything out, even the parts that make you look bad. I can only help you if I understand the full picture." That sentence alone almost made Olivia cry, not because it was kind, because it was honest, because in 7 years of marriage, nobody had asked Olivia to tell the full story, including the parts that made her look bad, and trusted that she was still worth listening to. She talked for 3 hours. Rachel listened, took notes, asked questions that were specific and direct, and occasionally made Olivia flinch because they got close to things she hadn't put into words before. By the time the coffee shop was preparing to close, Rachel had filled 14 pages of a yellow legal pad. She closed it, looked across the table at Olivia, and said, "He's going to fight this with everything he has. He has more money than you. He has more lawyers. He has a public image that the media has been building for him for 10 years. And he has a plan because men like this always have a plan. So we need to move faster than he expects. And we need evidence he doesn't know we have." Olivia reached into her coat and placed a small digital recording device on the table. Rachel looked at it. Then she looked at Olivia. "How many recordings?" 47, Olivia said, and for the first time since they sat down, Rachel Morgan allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The next 3 months were the most frightening of Olivia's life. She kept her routine. She got up at the same time. She attended the same events. She wore the same smile. She gave Daniel no reason to suspect that anything had changed, and every single day she felt like she was walking across a frozen lake, listening to the ice beneath her feet, wondering if this breath, this one step, would be the one where everything cracked open. Daniel's moods had always been unpredictable, but they were escalating. In the weeks after Olivia had first contacted Rachel, something in him seemed to sense that control was shifting, even if he couldn't have named it. He became more watchful. He asked more questions. He checked the calendar obsessively and wanted explanations for every hour she spent outside the house. One evening, he came home early from a meeting and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook. Just a notebook. Nothing incriminating. Notes she was taking for something Rachel had asked her to document. But the way he looked at that notebook made her stomach drop. "What are you writing?" he asked. She didn't flinch. She had practiced for this. "Just ideas," she said. "I was thinking about volunteering somewhere, a community program. You always say I need more structure during the day." He stared at the notebook for a moment longer than felt natural. Then he smiled. "That's a great idea," he said. "I'm proud of you." He walked past her to the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of water, and she did not exhale until she heard him climbing the stairs. She closed the notebook. Her hands were shaking, but she did not stop. 2 weeks later, while Daniel was in New York for 4 days, attending a conference, Olivia packed 2 bags, transferred money from an account. Daniel didn't know she had been quietly filling for 8 months by skimming from the household expense fund in amounts too small to notice, and she left. She drove herself to a small apartment that Rachel had arranged in advance. She sat on the floor of that empty apartment with her 2 bags beside her, her hands in her lap, and for a long time she didn't move. Then she picked up the phone, the real phone, her real phone, and she called Rachel. "I'm out," she said. "Good," Rachel said. Now the real work begins. The filing goes in tomorrow morning. The news reached Daniel Whitmore while he was still in New York. His assistant called him at 6:40 in the morning to tell him that his wife had filed for divorce and an emergency protective order, and that the story was being kept away from the press for now, but that wouldn't last. People who knew Daniel well said later that he went very quiet when he heard. Not the kind of quiet that means shock, the kind of quiet that means calculation. He was already on the phone with his legal team by 6:45. By the time he landed back in Chicago that afternoon, his lawyers had prepared a counter-strategy. They were going to paint Olivia as unstable. They were going to suggest she had a history of emotional volatility. They were going to argue that the protective order was unnecessary and the product of an unhappy woman looking for leverage in a divorce settlement. Daniel told his lead attorney, a man named Garrison Price, who wore suits that cost $3,000 and had never lost a high-profile case, "I want her destroyed in that courtroom. Do you understand me? I don't want her to walk out of that building with a single thing, not a chair, not a memory, nothing." Garrison Price had worked with difficult clients before, but something about the way Daniel said those words, the flatness in his voice, the absolute absence of any emotion that was not calculation made, Garrison felt just briefly like he was sitting across from someone he did not fully understand. He pushed the feeling aside. He had a job to do. The date for the temporary protection hearing was set. The Chicago courthouse was about to become the place where 7 years of silence finally broke open into sound. And in his chambers on a separate floor of that same building, a judge who had waited 6 years for news of his daughter opened his docket for the week and found himself assigned to a case, the case of Whitmore versus Whitmore. Judge Michael Carter looked at the name for a long moment. He told himself it was probably a coincidence. He told himself Whitmore was not an uncommon name. He told himself he had handled thousands of cases, and there was no reason to assume this one would be any different. He went home that night and sat in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he had drunk coffee alone on Christmas morning for 6 years, and he thought about his daughter. He wondered if she was okay. He had no way of knowing. He had no way of knowing anything. He picked up his phone. He looked at her contact information, still saved, still unchanged, the same number he hadn't used in 6 years. He put the phone back down. He went to bed, and the morning of the hearing arrived like all mornings eventually do, without asking anyone's permission, without giving anyone enough time. The wheels of justice once set in motion do not wait for anyone to be ready. Not the woman who finally found the courage to speak. Not the man who believed money could make him untouchable. And not the father who had spent 6 years hoping against all reasonable evidence that the story wasn't over yet. Because some stories, the ones that matter most, the ones that cost us the most to survive, do not end when we walk away from them. They wait. They gather themselves in the quiet. And when the time finally comes, when all the people and all the choices and all the years of silence converge in a single place, they reveal themselves with the force of everything that has been held back for too long. That morning was that moment, and none of them were ready, not even close. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. The case of Whitmore versus Whitmore was about to begin. The bailiff's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "All rise." Every person in courtroom 7 of the Cook County Courthouse got to their feet. Lawyers shuffled papers. Reporters in the back row straightened in their seats. And Daniel Whitmore, standing at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal gray suit that had been tailored specifically for his frame, adjusted his cufflinks with the practiced calm of a man who had never once in his adult life walked into a room and believed he might lose. He had chosen that suit deliberately. His stylist had recommended something softer, something that read as approachable and grieving. Daniel had rejected it. He wanted power. He wanted the room to look at him and see someone who belonged at the top of every hierarchy, someone whose word carried weight simply because of who he was. He had spent 30 years building that image, and he was not about to abandon it inside a courtroom of all places. Olivia was already seated at the table across from him when he entered. He had looked at her the moment he walked in. He always looked at her first in any room they shared because that was the habit of a man who needed to know exactly where his control was at all times. But this morning, something was different. She wasn't looking back at him. She was looking straight ahead, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her posture quiet and deliberate in a way that made something shift uncomfortably in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she was performing. He sat down and leaned toward Garrison Price, his lead attorney, and said quietly, "How long does this take today?" Garrison didn't look up from his notes. Depends on the judge. 2-3 hours. We present our motion to dismiss the protective order. They present their argument for keeping it in place. The judge rules. And the ruling. We're in a good position, Garrison said. She has no documented history of abuse, no hospital records, no police reports. We have 12 character witnesses ready to speak to your conduct. Today should be straightforward. Daniel leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Across the aisle, Rachel Morgan heard none of that conversation. But she didn't need to. She had faced Garrison Price in 2 previous cases, and she knew exactly how he operated. She knew his rhythm, his approach, the particular way he constructed a narrative in front of a judge that made his client look like the wronged party, regardless of the actual facts. She had lost to him once 6 years ago, early in her career. She hadn't lost since. She leaned close to Olivia and spoke just above a whisper. "How are you doing?" Olivia exhaled slowly. "I keep looking at my hands to make sure they're not shaking." "Are they?" "Not yet." "Good," Rachel said. "Keep them on the table where the judge can see them. Don't look at Daniel. Don't react to anything he does. No matter what comes out of his lawyers' mouths today, and some of it is going to be ugly, you stay exactly where you are. Can you do that?" Olivia looked at her lawyer. "I've been doing that for 7 years," she said. Rachel nodded once. "Today you do it for the last time." The judge entered, and the room changed. It was a different judge than anyone had expected. The original assigned judge, a woman named Hargrove, who had a reputation for running a tight courtroom, had been pulled into an emergency appellate matter that morning. The case had been reassigned less than 40 minutes before the hearing began to the only available judge in the building with a cleared docket. Judge Michael Carter walked to the bench. Howe was 63 years old, silver-haired, with the particular kind of posture that comes not from vanity, but from decades of sitting in a chair that represents the full weight of the law. He wore his robe the way he wore everything, without ceremony, without performance. He settled into his seat, opened the folder in front of him, and looked at the room. His eyes moved across the plaintiff's table first. Daniel Whitmore. He noted the name, he noted the suit, he noted the way the man sat relaxed, proprietary, like this room was something he had rented for the afternoon. Then his eyes moved to the other table. And for just a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, less than the time it takes to draw breath, something moved across Michael Carter's face that none of the lawyers caught, but that the court reporter, a woman named Diane who had worked in that building for 19 years, would later describe as the look of a man who has just seen a ghost. He closed his expression immediately. 35 years on the bench, and before it teach you that. They teach you to put everything personal behind a door and lock it, because the moment your feelings enter a courtroom, justice leaves. He looked back down at the folder. He had not seen his daughter in 6 years. The woman at that table was wearing a simple black dress and had her hair pulled back, and she was thinner than he remembered, and the line of her jaw was exactly the same as her mother's had been, and his chest did something he couldn't afford to let it do right now. He breathed. He composed himself. He called the room to order. "This is the matter of Whitmore versus Whitmore," he said. His voice was the same voice it always was in a courtroom, measured, authoritative, revealing nothing. "We're here on the petitioner's emergency motion for a temporary protective order and the respondent's motion to dismiss. Counsel, are both parties ready to proceed?" "Ready, Your Honor," Rachel said. "Ready, Your Honor," Garrison said, already rising from his chair with the particular fluid confidence of a man who believed the day was already going the way he planned. Garrison went first. Howe was good. There was no use pretending otherwise. He stood before the judge with the controlled ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and he built his opening argument the way a skilled contractor builds a wall methodically, each brick placed precisely the structure rising so smoothly that by the time you stepped back to look at it, you almost forgot that a different version of reality existed. Daniel Whitmore, Garrison explained, was a man of character, a man who had dedicated significant personal resources to the community, a man whose philanthropic record was a matter of public documentation. He had provided for his wife generously and completely. He had given her a life of stability and comfort. The marriage had experienced difficulties, as all marriages do, but the suggestion that Daniel Whitmore had been anything other than a devoted and caring husband was, Garrison said with just a hint of wounded dignity on his client's behalf, not only false, but malicious. The emergency protective order, he argued, had been filed strategically. It was not born from genuine fear, but from legal maneuvering designed to gain early advantage in a divorce proceeding that his client had not sought and had not wanted. He sat down. Several of Daniel's associates in the back rows exchanged confident looks. Then Rachel Morgan stood up. She was smaller than Garrison. She moved to the center of the room without rushing, without adjusting her jacket, without the performative calm of someone who was trying to look calm. She was actually calm. The way you are calm when you have 47 recordings in your evidence file and you have spent 3 months preparing for exactly this moment. Your Honor, she said, I am going to do something unusual. Before I present our argument, I would like to submit an item of evidence and request that it be played for the court. Garrison was on his feet immediately. Objection. Opposing counsel has not disclosed. It was disclosed this morning at 7:42 a.m. via email to the respondent's counsel, Rachel said without turning around. She reached into her bag and placed a single sheet of paper on the judge's clerk's desk. Time-stamped disclosure. I have the receipt. Garrison stopped. He sat back down, slowly. Judge Carter looked at the disclosure document the clerk handed him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Rachel. You may proceed. Rachel nodded. She connected a small device to the courtroom's audio system. Her hands were absolutely steady. She pressed play. The first thing that came through the speakers was silence, then the sound of a room, ambient, familiar to anyone who has ever been in a kitchen, the faint hum of a refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside a window. And then Daniel Whitmore's voice, clear, unmistakable, recorded without his knowledge one evening 8 months ago when Olivia had placed her small device on the shelf above the kitchen window and left it running before Daniel came home. His voice filled the courtroom. You think you can leave? Is that what you think? Let me explain something to you. Olivia, and I need you to listen very carefully because I'm only going to say this once. There is nowhere you go that I don't know about. There is not a lawyer in this city who will take your case because I have relationships with every firm that matters. And if you go to your father the judge, who thinks he's so righteous, I will make sure that man's career ends in the kind of scandal that follows a family for generations. Do you understand me? You are not a person without me. You are a role I created, and roles don't get to quit. The recording ended. The room was completely silent. The kind of silence that follows something that cannot be unsaid, that cannot be unheard, that hangs in the air of a room long after the sound itself has stopped. Garrison Price had gone very still. Daniel's jaw was tight. The relaxed confidence he had carried into the room was still there on the surface. He was too controlled to let it collapse entirely, but something beneath it had shifted. A calculation running behind his eyes. Damage assessment. How bad was this? Could it be explained? He leaned to Garrison and said, barely audible, "That's out of context. It was an argument. Get it thrown out." Garrison was already writing on his legal pad. Judge Carter had not moved. I was looking at the table where Olivia sat. She had not turned around during the recording. She had sat exactly where Rachel told her to sit, hands folded, looking forward. But her jaw was working just slightly the way a person's jaw works when they are holding something in, not tears exactly. Something harder than tears, something that costs more to keep inside. Michael Carter watched his daughter from the bench, and behind the locked door where he kept everything personal, something he had been holding for 6 years was pressing against it with terrible force. He looked back at his folder. "Counsel," he said to Garrison, "your client will have an opportunity to address the content of that recording. However, the recording has been properly disclosed, and I am admitting it into evidence. We will continue." Garrison nodded, his composure recovered. "Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to note for the record that you'll have your opportunity, Mr. Price." The judge's voice was quiet, final. "Continue, Ms. Morgan," Rachel continued. She did not sensationalize. She did not perform. She presented her argument the way she always presented arguments, with precision and with facts one after another, each one placed carefully on top of the last. She submitted documentation. Financial records showing the account Olivia had maintained without Daniel's knowledge. Not, Rachel explained, as evidence of deception, but as evidence of a woman who had known for a long time that her situation required an exit plan. She submitted testimony from 2 doctors Olivia had seen over the course of the marriage appointments, Daniel had known about and approved of, in which Olivia had described symptoms consistent with what one physician had carefully documented as a high-stress home environment. She submitted a photograph. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of image you would see in a news story or a documentary. It was a photograph of Olivia's right forearm taken 3 years ago, showing bruising that she had told the doctor she got from walking into a door frame. The doctor had written in his notes very quietly in a bracket beside his documentation of her explanation pattern, inconsistent with reported cause. He had not pushed further. Olivia had not offered more. But it was there, in the file, waiting. When Rachel finished, the courtroom felt different than it had an hour before. The confident murmuring among Daniel's associates in the back rows had stopped. Several reporters were writing with the focused urgency of people who understood they were watching something that would be on the front page tomorrow morning. Garrison mounted his counter-argument. He was still good. He challenged the recording's context. He challenged the photograph's chain of custody. He challenged the financial account as evidence of premeditated deception by a wife who had been planning to manipulate her husband's assets for years. He was disciplined, and he was thorough, and under different circumstances, against different evidence it might have been enough. But every argument he made felt slightly smaller than it had before. Because 47 recordings have a weight to them that even the best attorney in Chicago cannot fully lift. Rachel had played only one. Everyone in the room understood that there were 46 more. During a brief recess, Olivia stood and moved toward the small waiting area off the main hall. She needed water. She needed 30 seconds where the air was not thick with the specific atmosphere of a courtroom where your entire life was being debated by people who didn't know you. She was turning away from the water fountain when she heard Daniel's voice behind her. "Olivia." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "This is a mistake," Daniel said. His voice was still controlled, still the voice she had heard for 7 years, smooth, reasonable, the voice that had told her so many times that she was being irrational, that she was overreacting, that she was lucky. "You have no idea what you're doing. Those recordings, you think they're going to help you. You recorded me without my consent. That's illegal in Illinois. My lawyers are going to have them thrown out, and then you're going to be standing in that room with nothing." She turned around then. She looked at him. And she said something she had never said to him in 7 years of marriage. "I know exactly what I'm doing." She walked back into the courtroom. Daniel watched her go, and for the first time something that might have been the earliest warning of genuine fear moved through his chest. He dismissed it. He followed her back in. The afternoon session began. Garrison called his character witnesses. They were impressive people. A city alderman, 2 prominent Chicago businessmen, a woman who chaired a major charitable foundation, and described Daniel Whitmore as one of the most generous and community-minded people she had ever encountered. Each one spoke with sincerity and conviction. Each one said true things about a version of Daniel Whitmore that existed, the public version, the version that attended galas and signed checks and smiled for cameras. Rachel cross-examined each one with a single question. "In your relationship with Mr. Whitmore, have you ever been inside his home?" Each one said no. That was all she asked. She let the implication settle into the room without naming it. She was too good a lawyer to name it. The jury there was no jury. This was a bench hearing, but the reporters were serving the same function, didn't need it named. The home is where the other person lives. The home is where the other version of a person comes out. The home is the place none of these witnesses had ever been. By 4 in the afternoon, Judge Carter had heard everything both sides intended to present for the day. He would take the matter under advisement and rule on the protective order the following morning. He began the procedural close of the day's session, and that was when Daniel Whitmore made the decision that would end everything he had spent his life building. Garrison was collecting his papers. Rachel was leaning toward Olivia, saying something quiet. The bailiff was standing near the door. The reporters in the back were already thinking about their leads, their headlines, their deadlines. And Daniel stood up. He walked past his own attorney without saying a word. Garrison looked up and said quietly urgent, "Daniel, sit." Daniel was already moving. He crossed the space between the 2 tables. Olivia heard him before she saw him. She heard the change in the room, the intake of breath, the scrape of a chair, Rachel's voice saying, "Hey," and cutting off. She turned, and she did not have time to move. The sound of his hand connecting with the side of her face was not loud the way people would later say it was loud. In Olivia's memory, it was less a sound than a sensation, a bright, sharp shock of impact that turned the room white for a fraction of a second, and then brought everything into focus with terrible clarity. She fell back against the table. The room erupted. "Stop him!" someone shouted. Two bailiffs were already moving. Rachel was on her feet, her hand on Olivia's arm, voice urgent. "Are you okay? Olivia, are you okay?" And Garrison Price was standing at his table, looking at his client being restrained by two officers of the court, and thinking with the professional detachment of a man who has just watched a case become unwinnable that this was the single worst thing his client could have done. Daniel was not struggling against the bailiffs. He wasn't shouting. He was standing with his arms partially extended in front of him, breathing hard, looking at Olivia with an expression that was no longer calculating and no longer smooth, and no longer any version of the public man the alderman and the charity chair had described. He looked like what he was, and the room could finally see it. Judge Michael Carter had risen from his seat. He was standing behind the bench. The gavel was in his hand, but he hadn't struck it. He was looking at the woman who had just been struck. He was looking at her the way a person looks when recognition and horror arrive at the same moment, and there is nowhere to put either of them. His daughter, her face. The expression she was wearing, not just the pain of the impact, but something older, something that had lived in her face for years. The expression of a person who has been hurt before, and whose body remembered how to absorb it, even when her mind was screaming that this was not supposed to happen here. Michael Carter had looked at thousands of people from a bench. I had looked at victims and defendants and witnesses and lawyers and every variation of human pain and human cruelty that passes through the court system of a major American city. He had never once in 35 years made a sound that was personal. He made one now. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was a sound that came from somewhere below professional, below judicial, below every layer of restraint he had built over a career. It was the sound a father makes. Everyone in the room heard it. And Olivia, sitting at the table with Rachel's hand on her arm and her head ringing and her eyes adjusting back to the present, looked up toward the bench for the first time since the session began. She looked at the judge looked at her. 6 years collapsed into that moment like a building coming down. 6 years of silence, of letters unanswered, of holidays spent on opposite sides of a city, of a father who had tried to warn her, and a daughter who had been too deep inside someone else's version of her own life to hear it all. Of it arrived in that single exchange of recognition, lasting less than 3 seconds, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost, and the terrifying, heartbreaking possibility that it might not be too late. Olivia's breath caught. Her father's jaw tightened. He struck the gavel once. The sound cracked through the courtroom, and everyone who had been on their feet sat back down. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Carter said. His voice, the court voice, the voice that had sent people to prison and dismissed cases and ruled on custody arrangements and read verdicts that changed lives. That voice. But underneath it, if you were listening the right way, if you had spent your life knowing what that voice sounded like before it was a court voice, before it learned to keep everything out underneath it was something else. Daniel looked at the judge for the first time, really looked. I saw a man in his 60s with silver hair and a gavel, and the kind of eyes that had seen too much for too long to be impressed by anything as small as money or power or the particular brand of confidence that Daniel Whitmore had spent his life projecting. He did not yet understand. He would. "You," Judge Carter said, "have no idea what you have done." The silence that followed was total. And in that silence, everyone in the room understood simultaneously, from Garrison Price, who had gone white at the plaintiff's table, to the reporters in the back, who were no longer thinking about their headlines, but about something much larger, that whatever they had come here expecting to witness today, this was something else entirely. This was the moment a 7-year story finally ran out of room to hide. The bailiffs had Daniel's arms. The gavel was still in the judge's hand. And Olivia sat at the table with her palm against her cheek, and tears she refused to let fall burning behind her eyes, looking up at her father from the farthest and the closest she had been to him in 6 years. The case of Whitmore versus Whitmore had just become something no one in that building would forget. Not the lawyers, not the reporters, not the bailiffs. Not the court reporter named Diane, who had worked in that building for 19 years, and who would say later to anyone who asked that, in all her time she had never felt a room change the way that room changed in that moment. Like the air itself understood that something true had finally been spoken, and was making room for what came next. The gavel came down a second time, not because the room was still loud. The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something shifts so completely that noise feels inappropriate, like laughing at a funeral. The second strike of the gavel was not about restoring order. It was about giving Judge Michael Carter 3 additional seconds to rebuild the wall between who he was in this room and what he had just felt when he looked down from the bench and recognized his daughter's face. 3 seconds. I used every one of them. "Mr. Whitmore will be held in contempt," he said. His voice was back, the court voice, level, authoritative, revealing nothing. "The assault committed in this courtroom is being referred immediately to the state's attorney's office. Bailiff, you will hold Mr. Whitmore until the appropriate officers arrive." He paused. 1 breath. "I am also recusing myself from this case effective immediately due to a conflict of interest that has just come to my attention." Garrison Price was on his feet. "Your Honor, with respect, if there is a conflict. The recusal is not open for argument, Mr. Price." The judge gathered the folder in front of him with hands that were completely steady. "The matter will be reassigned. Court is adjourned." He stood. Everyone in the room stood. And Judge Michael Carter walked through the door behind the bench without looking back at the room, without looking back at Olivia. Because if he had looked back, he wasn't sure the wall would hold. The moment the door closed behind him, the courtroom fractured into a dozen separate conversations happening simultaneously. Garrison was on his phone. Daniel's associates were on their phones. 2 reporters were already moving toward the doors. The bailiffs had Daniel standing near the side wall, his wrists not yet cuffed, but his posture making it clear that leaving was not an option. Daniel was staring at the door the judge had walked through. Something was working behind his eyes, something that hadn't been working before. He was reviewing the last 10 minutes of his life the way a chess player reviews a losing sequence, looking for the move that undid everything, looking for the precise moment the board turned against him. He was beginning to understand, and understanding was making it worse. Rachel had her arm around Olivia's shoulders. She was speaking quietly, directly, in the calm, rapid-fire way she spoke when situations moved faster than anyone anticipated. "You're okay. You're physically okay. I need you to tell me you understand that." "I understand," Olivia said. Her voice was steady. Her hand was still against her cheek. That was his answer to everything. Whenever he couldn't argue anymore, that was always his answer. "I know." Rachel squeezed her shoulder. "And he just gave us the clearest evidence we could have asked for in front of 7 witnesses on camera." She paused. "Did you see the judge's face?" Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Do you know him?" Olivia lowered her hand from her cheek. She looked at the door her father had walked through. She looked at it for long enough that Rachel understood the answer without being told. "Olivia," Rachel said carefully, "is that your father?" "Yes," Olivia said. The word landed between them like something fragile. Rachel absorbed it. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to process what this meant, legally, professionally, personally, and then she said, "Okay, we deal with that, one thing at a time." On the other side of the room, Daniel had been moved to a holding area off the main corridor. The 2 bailiffs flanked him. He had asked for Garrison twice. He had been told Garrison was handling paperwork. He stood with his back straight and his jaw set, and the particular posture of a man who was performing composure for an audience that wasn't fully buying it anymore. Then Garrison came in. He closed the door behind him. He looked at his client. And Daniel, who had been reading people's expressions for 30 years as a tool of negotiation, read Garrison Price's face immediately and understood that whatever he was about to hear was not going to be good. "Talk to me," Daniel said. Garrison set his briefcase down. He pulled a chair out, sat in it, and folded his hands on the table. He had the demeanor of a doctor about to explain a diagnosis. "The assault charge is straightforward. You struck your wife in open court in front of bailiffs, a court reporter, a judge, and working journalists. There is no angle on that. It happened, and it was recorded." The recording of you from the kitchen, Illinois, is a 2-party consent state, yes, but the law has exceptions for recorded evidence of criminal conduct. Rachel Morgan knew that when she submitted it. She had it reviewed by a consent law specialist before she disclosed it. "I should have anticipated that." He said that last sentence the way a surgeon says, "I should have caught that earlier," without self-flagellation, just clinical acknowledgement of a missed step. The bigger problem is the judge. Daniel's eyes narrowed. The recusal. The conflict of interest he cited. Do you know who that judge is? Do you know his name? Daniel had read the case assignment that morning. He tried to remember. Carter, Michael Carter. Garrison watched his client's face. The moment arrived. Slow, then fast. The way comprehension always arrives when it's the kind you don't want. Daniel said very quietly, "Carter." "Judge Michael Carter," Garrison said. "Olivia Carter Whitmore," her father. The silence in the holding room was different from the silence in the courtroom. The courtroom silence had been the silence of an audience witnessing something. This silence was private. This was the silence of a man who had spent 7 years systematically cutting his wife off from every person who loved her, who had threatened her father's career by name, on a recording now entered into evidence, who had just physically attacked her in front of that same father, and was now sitting in a room working out the full architecture of what he had built, and what it had just cost him. Daniel's hands resting on the table were very still. "He'll recuse himself properly," he said more to himself than to Garrison. "He has to. Conflict of interest. Whatever he saw, it doesn't affect the case." "It affects the optics," Garrison said. "I don't care about optics." "Daniel." Garrison leaned forward, and this was notable because Garrison Price did not lean forward. He sat with the controlled posture of a man who understood that physical composure was part of professional authority. The fact that he was leaning forward meant what he was about to say was important enough to break the habit. "A judge just recused himself from your case on the grounds of personal conflict. That recusal is public record. Every reporter who was in that room today knows that judge's name. It will take them 40 minutes to make the connection. By tonight, the story is not just that you hit your wife in court. The story is that you hit your wife in court in front of her father, who happened to be the judge." He paused. "And there are 46 more recordings." The room was quiet. "Get me out of here today," Daniel said. "I'm working on it. Today, Garrison." Garrison picked up his briefcase and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I've represented a lot of difficult clients. I've found legal arguments for things I personally found reprehensible because that's the job. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because the answer is going to determine how I proceed." "Ask it." "Those recordings, the kitchen recording we heard today, is there more on those recordings that I haven't heard yet? Anything that goes beyond financial threats or intimidation?" Daniel said nothing. Garrison turned around and looked at his client, and Daniel Whitmore, who had spent 30 years looking at people and knowing exactly what to say to them, looked at his attorney and said nothing. Garrison Price left the room. In his chambers on the 4th floor, Michael Carter had removed his robe and was sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, looking at nothing. His clerk had knocked twice, and he had told her to hold everything. His phone had rung 4 times. He had not answered it. He was sitting with what he knew. His daughter had been in that courtroom. His daughter had been married for 7 years to the man who had just struck her in front of him. His daughter had walked into that room today looking thin and careful and quietly terrified in a way that she was trying very hard not to show, and he had seen it the way you see things about the people you raised because you watched their faces learn how to have expressions, and he had sat above her and done his job and not said a word. And then Daniel Whitmore had hit her. Michael Carter pressed his palms harder against the desk. How as a judge, he understood conflict of interest. He understood that his recusal was correct, was mandatory, was the only legally and ethically appropriate response to discovering that the petitioner in a domestic case before him was his own daughter. He had done the right thing. He would be criticized by no court, no bar association, no review panel for the decision he had made in that courtroom. But his daughter was in a building 2 floors below him, and he had not spoken to her in 6 years. He picked up his phone, he put it down, he picked it up again, he dialed his clerk. "Find out where Ms. Whitmore, the petitioner, find out if she's still in the building, and find out who her attorney is." His clerk said, "Her attorney is Rachel Morgan Judge. She's still in the building. They're in consultation room 3. He sat for another moment. Then he put his jacket on, and walked out of his chambers. The hallway was familiar. He had walked it for 11 years. Every crack in the floor, every turn, every elevator bank. He walked it now the way you walk a familiar route when your mind is somewhere entirely else, automatically the body knowing the path, while the person inside it is somewhere 6 years back, standing in a kitchen in Evanston, watching his daughter walk out a door. He stopped outside consultation room 3. He knocked. Rachel Morgan opened the door. She looked at him. She was a woman who had been in enough rooms with enough judges to know how to read them. What she read in Michael Carter's face in that moment was not what she usually saw in judges' faces. What she saw was a father, barely held together, trying very hard to look like something else. "Judge Carter," she said. "Ms. Morgan." His voice was careful. "I know this is irregular. I am not here in any judicial capacity. I have recused myself, and I want to be clear that this visit has no bearing on the case. But I would like—" He paused, and in that pause lived 6 years. "I would like to speak with my daughter, if she's willing." Rachel looked at him for a moment, then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Olivia was sitting at the table. She had heard his voice through the door. She was sitting very still with her hands in her lap and her face doing something complicated, the kind of complicated that happens when love and loss and time and pride and grief are all trying to occupy the same expression simultaneously. Michael Carter walked into the room. Rachel closed the door quietly behind him and stood near it close enough to intervene if something went wrong, far enough to give them space. Father and daughter looked at each other. 6 years of silence in a room that was maybe 15 feet wide. Michael Carter's throat worked. He said Olivia, just her name, nothing else. And Olivia, who had held herself together through 7 years of marriage and 3 months of the most terrifying strategic withdrawal of her life, and a courtroom hearing where her entire history was publicly argued, and a blow to the side of her face that was still sending small pulses of pain through her jaw, Olivia came apart. Not loudly, not with the kind of dramatic collapse that happens in movies. She came apart the way real people come apart when they have been holding something for so long that their arms simply give out. Her face broke open, her breath caught, her shoulders dropped, and Michael Carter crossed the room in 4 steps and put his arms around his daughter for the first time in 6 years. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "I warned you." He didn't say anything at all. Neither did she. They stood in that consultation room, the judge who had sat above a courtroom and watched his daughter be struck and held every human impulse he had behind 35 years of judicial discipline, and the woman who had walked away from her father's warning and into 7 years of erasure. And the silence between them this time was completely different from every other silence they had shared. This one felt like the beginning of something, not the end. Rachel Morgan looked at the wall and gave them whatever time they needed. They needed about 4 minutes. Then Olivia pulled back, pressed her hands briefly against her face, and straightened. She was not done crying, but she was done for now with the part of crying that needed to happen before she could speak. "How long have you known?" her father asked. He was still holding her shoulders. He looked at her face. The cheekbone where Daniel's hand had connected was reddening, and something moved through Michael Carter's expression when he saw it, something that took considerable effort to contain. "Known what?" she said. "That you needed to leave." She looked at him. "A long time," she said, "but knowing and being able to, those are different things." He nodded. He understood that. He had watched it enough times from a bench to understand it in his bones. "Are you hurt? Not just today. Are you—" "I'm okay," she said. And then, because it was her father and she was done performing, "I wasn't for a long time, but I'm okay now." He released her shoulders. He stepped back. He put his judge's face back on, not completely, not the way it would be in a courtroom, but enough to help him say what came next. "I can't be involved in your case. You understand that. The recusal stands, and it's the right call." "I know. But I want you to know." He stopped. He looked at Rachel, then back at Olivia. "Whatever you need, whatever this takes, I'm here. I should have said that 6 years ago. I should have found a way to—" "Dad," she said it simply. "I know." The word Dad. 6 years since she had said it. It hung in the air of that small room like something alive. Michael Carter collected himself with the visible effort of a man who had a great deal more to say and understood that today was not the day to say all of it. "Call me tonight," he said. "Please." "I will," she said. He nodded once, straightened his jacket, and looked at Rachel. "Take care of her." "That's what I do," Rachel said. He left. Rachel waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she turned to Olivia and studied her for a moment. "You okay?" "I don't know," Olivia said honestly. "Ask me in an hour." "Fair enough." Rachel sat down across from her and opened her legal pad. "Because we have work to do. The assault charge changes everything. And I got a call during the recess that changes it even further." Olivia looked at her. "What call?" Rachel set her pen down. "Before I tell you this, I need you to understand that what happened in that courtroom today, Daniel losing control like that, it didn't just confirm our case for the protective order. It may have cracked something much bigger open. My office got a call this afternoon from a federal investigator." Olivia went very still. "What kind of federal investigator?" Rachel looked at her steadily. "The kind that investigates financial crimes, Olivia. The kind that has been building a case against Daniel Whitmore for 2 years and has been waiting for a crack in the public image. Today gave them a crack big enough to drive through." The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. This one had weight. This one had the specific gravity of a story that had just revealed itself to be much larger than anyone in it had fully understood. Olivia looked at her hands. She thought about 7 years of charity galas and investor dinners and business trips, and the careful management of an image that Daniel tended the way a gardener tends something they intend to sell. She thought about the conversations she had half heard through closed doors, the names she had learned not to ask about, the phone calls that ended when she walked into rooms. "How bad?" she said. "We don't know yet," Rachel said, but the investigator used the word extensive, and she asked if you would be willing to speak with them. Olivia looked up. "She said your testimony, specifically what you observed inside the marriage, the conversations, the meetings, the financial arrangements, could be significant." Olivia was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about Daniel's voice on that recording playing through the courtroom speakers. She was thinking about the way he had said, "You are not a person without me." She was thinking about every room she had sat in, every conversation she had been present, for every name and number and meeting she had filed away in the quiet, careful place inside her mind that he had never managed to reach. She had thought she was keeping that information to survive. She had not fully understood until this moment that she had also been keeping it as evidence. "Yes," she said. "Tell them yes." Meanwhile, 3 floors down, Daniel Whitmore had been released on a personal recognizance bond arranged by Garrison at extraordinary speed and at extraordinary cost. He walked out of the building with his attorney beside him and 2 associates flanking him, and his phone already in his hand and his mind already running at the particular velocity it ran at when the situation was serious. He said to Garrison, walking, not slowing down, "What do we know about the investigator?" Garrison glanced at him. "What investigator?" "Federal, Financial Crimes Division. Do they have something?" Garrison stopped walking. Daniel was 3 steps ahead before he noticed. He turned. Garrison was looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time in their professional relationship, not entirely neutral. "Daniel, is there something I need to know before we go any further? Is there something about your financial affairs that is going to come out that you have not told me?" Daniel looked at his attorney for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to make some calls." And he walked to his car. Garrison stood on the courthouse steps and watched his client get into the back seat of a black SUV. He pulled out his own phone. He had 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at the number for a moment. He called back. The voice on the other end said, "Mr. Price, thank you for returning my call. My name is Special Agent Denise Hartwell. I'm with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I wonder if you have a few minutes." Garrison Price sat down on the courthouse steps. For the first time in a very long career, he sat down without choosing to. His legs simply decided that sitting was appropriate given what he was hearing. Because Special Agent Denise Hartwell was telling him things about his client, documented evidence built over 2 years, things that Garrison had not known. That he could not have known because Daniel had been careful about what he told his lawyers, the same way he was careful about what he let Olivia hear through closed doors. But Olivia had been in those rooms for 7 years, and now she was going to talk. By the time Daniel's car reached his building, and he stepped out into the lobby and took the elevator to his penthouse and poured himself a drink that he carried to the window and stood there looking at the city he had spent 30 years building himself into. By the time all of that happened, the architecture of what was coming had already been set in motion in a consultation room on the 3rd floor of the Cook County Courthouse. He didn't know that yet. He stood at his window with his drink. He was still running calculations, still looking for the move that saved the board, still believing in the fundamental way that men like Daniel Whitmore believe things, that the rules that applied to everyone else were a problem he could solve with enough money and enough intelligence and enough time. He did not yet understand. He had used all 3. Across the city, in the small apartment that Rachel had arranged 3 months ago, Olivia sat on the floor, the same floor she had sat on the night she arrived with 2 bags and shaking hands, and she called her father. He answered on the first ring. "Livy," he said. the name he had called her since she was 4 years old, before she was Olivia, to anyone before she knew what it meant to walk away from people who loved you because someone else had convinced you they were the obstacle. She pressed her hand over her eyes. "Dad," she said, "I have so much to tell you." "I know," he said. "I have time. I have all the time in the world." And outside the window of that small apartment, Chicago was doing what it always did, moving loud, indifferent to any individual story, full of 10,000 lives unfolding simultaneously, each one carrying its own weight of what had been lost and what might still be found. But inside that apartment on that phone call, between a father and a daughter who had lost 6 years to one man's need to control everything he touched, time was doing something different. It was giving itself back, slowly. The way time does when the thing that was stolen from it has finally been named. The assault charge had been filed. The federal investigation was open. The 46 remaining recordings were sitting in Rachel Morgan's evidence file. And Daniel Whitmore, standing at his penthouse window with his untouched drink, was about to discover that the most dangerous person in his life had never been a rival businessman, a federal agent, or a judge on a bench. It had been the woman he spent 7 years trying to make disappear, the woman who had kept everything, the woman who was at this precise moment telling her father everything she knew. The phone call between Olivia and her father lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Michael Carter did not interrupt. He did not say, "I knew it," or "I told you," or any of the things a person who had been right about something for 7 years might reasonably feel entitled to say. He listened the way he had listened to testimony for 35 years, with his full attention, with the understanding that the person speaking needed to be heard completely before any response was appropriate, and with the quiet discipline of someone who knew that the most important thing he could offer right now was not his opinion but his presence. Olivia told him everything. Not in the careful, strategic way she had told Rachel, organized, documented, built for legal purpose. She told her father the way you tell someone who knew you before you became who the years made you. She told him about the first year when she still believed the control was love. She told him about the second year when she began to understand the difference but couldn't name it yet. She told him about the phone calls she had heard through closed doors, the names that appeared on documents she wasn't supposed to see. The investors who came to dinner and left, with expressions she couldn't read, the business trips that didn't quite add up when she looked at the calendar against what Daniel said he had been doing. She told him about a man named Victor Hale. Michael Carter wrote the name down. Victor Hale had appeared in Olivia's life 3 years into the marriage as one of Daniel's primary business partners. He was introduced at a dinner as a real estate developer from New York, well-dressed, well-spoken, the kind of man who made you feel like the room had gotten slightly more expensive simply by having him in it. Daniel had told Olivia that Victor was a key investor in several of his Chicago development projects, that their partnership was the backbone of his most profitable recent ventures. But 6 months after that dinner, Olivia had overheard a conversation. She had come downstairs at 2 in the morning for water. Daniel's office door was not fully closed. She stood in the hallway, not deliberately eavesdropping, not yet just a woman who froze at the sound of her husband's voice at 2 in the morning, talking to someone about numbers that were too large to be casual. She heard Daniel say, "The Meridian accounts need to be moved before the quarter close. All of it. Victor, I don't care how you structure it. I need that money in a position that doesn't appear on any balance sheet, that anyone outside this conversation has access to." Then a pause. Then Daniel's voice, quieter and harder. "The investors don't need to understand the structure. That's why we have the structure. That's the entire point of the structure. If they understood it, we wouldn't need it." Olivia had gone back upstairs. She had lain in bed for 3 hours not sleeping, listening to Daniel finish his call, and eventually come to bed and fall asleep with the complete ease of a man who had never once in his life been kept awake by his own conscience. She had told no one. At the time, she didn't have anyone to tell, but she had remembered it. She had added it to the place inside her where she kept everything. When she finished telling her father, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Michael Carter said, "Victor Hale, the Meridian accounts. Do you know anything else? Any other names? Any other account names? Anything you saw on documents?" Olivia thought carefully. She had learned in the past 3 months working with Rachel to trust her memory more than she had trusted it in years. Daniel had spent so much time telling her she misremembered things, misunderstood things, took things out of context, that she had developed a habit of second-guessing her own recollection. Rachel had helped her understand that the things she remembered were real, That memory is not made less valid by someone else's insistence that it isn't. There was a name on a document I saw once, she said. Castle Point Holdings. He left a folder on the kitchen table once, and it had that name at the top. I only saw it for a second before he came back in the room and took it. Castle Point Holdings, her father repeated. He was writing quickly. Dad, Olivia said, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, he said carefully, that the people who called Rachel's office today didn't call because of what happened in the courtroom. They called because of the courtroom tape, yes, but also because something that happened today broke something open that they have been waiting on for a while. They knew what they needed. They just needed an entry point. He paused. And Olivia, I want you to understand something. What you're about to do, talking to the federal investigators, it's going to be harder than anything you've done so far, because it will make you a witness. And being a witness means your name is attached to this in a way that doesn't go away quietly. I know, she said, and you still want to do it. He threatened you, she said, on that recording. He said he would end your career. He said he would make our family a scandal. He threatened you specifically by name to keep me from coming to you. Her voice was steady. Yes, I want to do it. Michael Carter was quiet. I'm proud of you, he said. He hadn't said those words to her in 6 years. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was different, quieter, the voice of someone receiving something they hadn't known they were still waiting for. Thank you, Dad. They stayed on the phone another 20 minutes, not talking about Daniel or investigators or evidence, talking about nothing important, the way people do when they have been apart for too long and they're not ready to hang up, because hanging up feels too much like the years of silence they are only just beginning to find their way out of. By the time they said goodnight, it was past 11. Olivia set the phone on the floor beside her and sat in the quiet of her apartment. She was not the same woman who had sat on this floor 3 months ago. She wasn't sure she could have told you exactly what was different. It wasn't that she was healed. It wasn't that the 7 years were erased, or that the fear that had lived in her chest for so long was simply gone. Healing doesn't work like that. It doesn't arrive all at once in a clean, dramatic moment. It arrives in pieces, in conversations and phone calls that last 2 hours and 40 minutes, in the small accumulation of moments where you are treated like a person who has the right to take up space. She lay down on the floor with her jacket over her and slept the deepest sleep she had in years. The next morning arrived fast. The news had broken overnight. By 6:30 a.m., the story was on 3 major Chicago news websites and 2 national outlets. By 7, it was on cable news. The footage captured on a reporter's personal phone as a backup to the official court recording showed Daniel Whitmore crossing the courtroom floor and striking his wife. The clip was 12 seconds long. It ran on a loop. And with every loop, the version of Daniel Whitmore that Chicago had spent a decade believing in, the visionary, the philanthropist, the generous community leader, became slightly harder to find beneath what the footage was showing. Rachel called Olivia at 7:15. Have you seen the news? Not yet, Olivia said. Don't watch it today. Not today. We have a meeting at 10 with Special Agent Hartwell, and I need you focused, not reactive. Can you do that? Yes. Good. Also, Rachel paused in the way she paused when something significant was coming. Garrison Price called me this morning, unofficially. Olivia frowned. Daniel's lawyer called you. Why? He didn't say explicitly, but the call itself says enough. When the opposing counsel calls you informally the morning after, something like yesterday, it usually means one of 2 things. Either they're fishing for what you have, or they're beginning to consider that their client is a problem they need to manage rather than defend. Which one is it? I think, Rachel said, it might be both. The meeting with Special Agent Denise Hartwell took place in a conference room in a federal building on Dearborn Street. Hartwell was 44, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the manner of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where people lied to her and had developed an extremely precise instrument for detecting it. She shook Olivia's hand, looked at her directly, and said, "Thank you for coming. I want to be clear about something before we begin. You are not a target of this investigation. You are a potential witness. Everything you tell me today is voluntary, and you have the right to have your attorney present throughout." Rachel was already sitting at the table. "We're ready," Rachel said. Hartwell opened a folder. What followed was 3 hours that Olivia would later describe to her father as the strangest experience of her life. Not because of what was asked of her, but because of what she discovered in the asking. With every question, Hartwell posed careful, specific building from detail to detail, the way a person builds something architectural. Olivia discovered that she knew more than she had realized she knew. The name Castle Point Holdings, it turned out, was not a minor reference on a single document. It was the center of a web. Castle Point was a shell company registered in Delaware, connected through a series of layered subsidiary entities to a fund called Meridian Capital Partners, the same Meridian Daniel had mentioned in the phone call Olivia had overheard at 2 a.m. 3 years ago. Meridian Capital Partners had raised over $200 million from private investors over the course of 6 years, presenting itself as a boutique real estate investment fund with strong Chicago market ties and an exceptional return record. The return record was fabricated. The investments were largely non-existent. The money had been moving through Castle Point, through 3 additional shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands, through a series of transfers that were designed to look like legitimate business activity into accounts controlled by Daniel and Victor Hale personally. $200 million. Hartwell set a photograph on the table. "Do you recognize this man?" Olivia looked at the photograph. Victor Hale. Older than she remembered, a little heavier, but unmistakably the man who had sat across from her at a dinner table 3 years ago and charmed her with stories about the New York real estate market and asked her thoughtful questions about herself that she had found surprising and slightly disarming from a business associate. "Yes," she said. "That's Victor Hale. I met him at our house. Daniel introduced him as his primary investment partner." Hartwell nodded and made a note. "Victor Hale was arrested this morning in New York." The room went very still. Rachel looked up from her notepad. Olivia stared at the photograph. "I was arrested this morning," Hartwell continued, her voice, the same careful neutral it had been throughout, "and he has already indicated a willingness to cooperate, which means the timeline we were working with has accelerated significantly." She looked at Olivia. "What you observed inside that marriage is going to be important, because Victor Hale can tell us about the financial structure from the outside, but you were inside, you were in the rooms. And in cases like this, the inside account is frequently the one that makes the difference." Olivia thought about 7 years of being in rooms. 7 years of being treated like furniture, like she was present but not registering, like the fact that she was quiet meant she wasn't absorbing, like erasing a person's confidence and agency also erased their ability to observe and remember. Daniel had underestimated her in every possible direction. "Tell me everything you need to know," Olivia said. She talked for 3 hours. She talked about names and dates and conversations and documents, glimpsed and overheard phone calls, and the particular look on Daniel's face at certain dinners when certain topics came up, and the way certain men arrived at their house and left too quickly, and the calendar entries that didn't match the trips and the nights when he came home different, not drunk, not visibly upset, but carrying some specific weight of a man who has done something he needs to not think about. Hartwell recorded everything. She asked clarifying questions that were precise and smart. Several times she stopped and said quietly, "That's very helpful." And she said it the way a person says it when they mean it specifically, not as a conversational placeholder. By the time it was over, Olivia's voice was hoarse. Rachel drove her back to the apartment. They rode in silence for most of the way. Then Rachel said, "You were extraordinary in there." Olivia looked out the window. "I just told the truth." "I know," Rachel said. "That's what made it extraordinary." Meanwhile, in a law office on Michigan Avenue, Garrison Price was having a conversation with Daniel Whitmore that was not going well for either of them. Garrison had spread 6 documents across the conference table. He had obtained them through channels available to defense attorneys when they needed to understand the scope of what their client was facing. He had looked at these documents for most of the previous night. He had not slept. He had made coffee at 3 a.m. and sat at his kitchen table and looked at what he was holding and thought, with the exhausted clarity of someone who had spent their career in law and still occasionally encountered a case that reminded him why the law existed about what he was going to say to his client. Now he was saying it. "The federal case," Garrison said, "is not a problem I can manage for you. I need you to understand that clearly. This is not a civil matter. This is not reputation management. This is a federal fraud investigation with documented evidence, a cooperating co-defendant, and a witness whose testimony covers 7 years of internal access to your business operations." Daniel was sitting across from him with his hands flat on the table. He looked like he had also not slept. but he looked like he hadn't slept the way a machine that has been running too hard looks, strained, overworked, but still running, still calculating. Victor is cooperating. Victor was arrested this morning, and he cooperated within the first 4 hours. That is not a man who is going to protect you, Daniel. That is a man who is saving himself. Victor doesn't know everything. Olivia does. The name landed in the room. Daniel's jaw tightened. It was the smallest movement, barely visible, but Garrison had been watching his client's face for 3 years, and he caught it. She doesn't know. She was in that house for 7 years, Garrison said. She has 47 recordings. She has the name Castle Point Holdings. She has the name Meridian. She gave a 3-hour statement to a federal agent this morning. He paused. Daniel, she was not who you thought she was. The silence in the conference room had a specific quality to it. It was the silence of a man whose entire strategy had been built on a single foundational assumption, and that assumption had just been shown to be wrong. Daniel had believed for 7 years that Olivia was manageable, that her isolation made her dependent, that her dependency made her compliant, that her compliance meant she would never be a credible threat. He had treated her like a prop in the story of his own life, something that added to the image, something that could be controlled by controlling the information she had access to and the people she was allowed to trust. He had forgotten, or perhaps never understood, that isolation and dependency and compliance do not actually prevent a person from seeing. They just prevent them from speaking, until they don't. "What are my options?" Daniel said. Not a question, a statement of demand. Garrison looked at his client. "You have 2. You can fight this, which will be expensive, prolonged, and given the current state of the evidence, likely unsuccessful. Or you can cooperate with the federal investigation with the divorce proceedings and attempt to negotiate terms that reduce your exposure." Cooperate. Daniel repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. "It means telling the truth, Daniel. It means—" "I know what it means." He stood up abruptly, walked to the window, stood with his back to Garrison, looking at Michigan Avenue below him. "She did this," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "She planned all of this." Garrison waited. 7 years, Daniel said. 7 years I gave her everything, and she was surviving, Garrison said. Daniel turned around. Garrison met his eyes. "I've been a lawyer for 28 years. I've represented difficult clients. I've made arguments I wasn't proud of because the job required it. But I want to say something to you as a person, not as your attorney, and you can fire me for saying it if you want." He paused. "What happened in that courtroom yesterday, what I saw on your wife's face when you struck her, that was not the face of a woman who had been given everything. That was the face of a woman who had been surviving something. And the reason you're sitting in this office today with federal charges building against you is not because she planned anything. It's because she stopped being afraid of you." Daniel stared at him. Garrison picked up his briefcase. "I'll give you 24 hours to decide how you want to proceed. But I need an answer by tomorrow morning, because the federal timetable is not waiting for you to be comfortable with your options." He left. Daniel stood at the window of the empty conference room. Below him, the city moved. Cars, people, the ordinary machinery of a day that did not know or care about the architecture of what was collapsing in this room. He had built everything from a single conviction that the world was made of people who could be used and people who did the using, and that the only honest thing was to understand which one you were and act accordingly. He had built companies on it. He had built a marriage on it. He had built a public image so carefully constructed that even the people closest to him, his associates, his lawyers, his investors, had seen only what he intended. He had not built it to last. He had built it to survive inspection, and for a long time it had. I thought about the courtroom. He thought about the moment when he had crossed the floor, and even now, standing in this room, he could not fully explain what had happened to him in that moment. He was not a man who acted without calculation. He was not a man who lost control. But something in the way, Olivia had sat at that table with her hands folded, with her face quiet, with the recording of his voice playing through the courtroom speakers, and the whole room listening to every word he had said in what he believed was the privacy of his own kitchen. Something in all of that had broken through the calculation and reached something underneath it, something that was not strategy, something that was older and uglier and more honest than anything he had shown in public in 30 years. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. Then he picked up his phone. He called a number he had not called in 8 months. The number rang 4 times. Then a voice he knew answered. "Daniel," the voice said, cautious, already afraid. "I need to talk to you," Daniel said. "I'm not—" "It's already done," Daniel said. "Victor is cooperating. Olivia is talking to federal investigators as of this morning. Whatever you think you're protecting by staying quiet, it's already been found." He paused. "The only question left is whether you cooperate now and have any control over what happens to you, or you wait and have none." A long silence. Then, "What do you want me to do?" Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in 30 years of building things that were designed to collapse other people, something collapsed in him instead. "I want you to call a lawyer," he said, "and I want you to tell the truth." He hung up. He stood at the window. He was still standing there when his phone rang again 15 minutes later. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Something made him. The voice on the other end identified itself as an assistant to the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. They were requesting a meeting, at his earliest convenience, which the voice made clear with the particular politeness of federal officials who are not actually making a request, meant tomorrow. Daniel set the phone on the windowsill. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked out at the city again. The city where he had spent 30 years. The city where he had built companies out of other people's trust and called it genius, where he had built a marriage out of another person's isolation and called it love, where he had constructed an image so complete and so carefully maintained that for a decade almost no one had been able to see through it. Almost no one. His wife had seen through it from inside. His wife's father had seen through it from the very beginning. And the woman he had spent 7 years trying to make disappear had turned out to be the most dangerous person in his entire world. Not because she was malicious, not because she had planned his destruction, but because she had simply refused in the one part of herself he could never reach to stop being real. He had threatened her father's career on a recording. He had struck her in open court. He had underestimated her for 7 years, and she had kept everything. 3 miles away, in a small apartment that didn't belong to anyone, Daniel Whitmore knew, Olivia Carter was on the phone with her father again, not talking about the case this time, talking about dinner. Michael Carter wanted to know if she would come to the house in Evanston on Sunday. He said he had bought coffee her brand, the one she had always liked, the one he had kept buying every week for 6 years, out of a habit he had never managed to break even when there was no one to drink it but him. Olivia said yes. She said it the way you say yes to something simple when the simple things are what you miss the most. And somewhere in the city, in the federal building on Dearborn Street, Special Agent Denise Hartwell was typing the summary of a 3-hour witness interview that was going to become one of the most significant pieces of testimony in a fraud case that had been building for 2 years. The name at the top of the document was Olivia Carter Whitmore. Witness, not victim, not possession, not the role someone had written for her. A witness, a woman who had been in the rooms, a woman who had kept everything, a woman who had survived 7 years of being told she was nothing and had emerged with the one thing that no amount of money or control or carefully constructed image could manufacture or destroy. The truth. And the truth, as it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Hartwell hit save on the document. She closed her laptop. She picked up her phone and called her supervisor. "We're moving forward," she said. "We have everything we need." Sunday morning arrived the way Sunday mornings in Chicago arrive in late October, quietly with a cold that settles into you before you fully wake up, the kind of cold that makes you want coffee and something warm and a room where the people inside it matter to you. Olivia drove herself to Evanston. She had not driven this route in 6 years, but her hands knew it. The body remembers the roads it traveled when it was still becoming itself, and her hands moved through the turns without her having to think about them, left on Green Bay, right on the familiar street. The modest 2-story house, sitting exactly where it had always sat, the porch light on, even though it was morning, because her father had always left the porch light on. A habit from when she was a teenager who kept late hours, and he wanted her to know the house was awake and waiting. She sat in the car for a moment before she got out. She pressed her hands against the steering wheel and breathed. 6 years. She got out of the car. Her father opened the front door before she reached the porch. He must have heard the car. He was standing in the doorway in a flannel shirt and old jeans, the weekend version of him that she had grown up with and missed, without letting herself admit she missed it. and he looked older than she remembered in some ways, and exactly the same in all the ways that mattered. He said nothing. He stepped forward and put his arms around her again, the same way he had in the consultation room, without ceremony, without the weight of everything that needed to be said eventually, just the immediate and uncomplicated fact of his arms around her. She held on. The coffee was on the kitchen table when they came inside. Her brand, the same brand. She sat down in the same chair she had sat in her entire childhood and picked up the mug and held it with both hands, and her father sat across from her, and they looked at each other across a table that had been waiting 6 years for this exact morning. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. "Better," she said. "You, better," he said. They both knew neither of them had slept well in years. They both knew that saying better was honest because it was true in the direction of things, even if they weren't all the way there yet. They had learned in the past week of phone calls how to speak to each other again. Not the way they spoke when she was 23 and certain about everything. The way people speak when they have both been through something, and they understand that the other person has been through something too, and that understanding is the thing they are rebuilding on. They talked for 2 hours before either of them mentioned Daniel's name. And when they finally did, it was Michael who brought it up. He set down his mug, looked at his daughter and said, "The U.S. Attorney's Office made a formal announcement yesterday afternoon. I didn't want to call you about it last night because I thought you needed the evening." Olivia set her mug down. "Tell me." Daniel has been formally charged. Federal wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, 17 counts total. Victor Hale entered a full cooperation agreement 3 days ago, and his testimony combined with your statement, combined with the financial documentation the investigators have been building for 2 years, it's substantial, Olivia. The U.S. Attorney described it as one of the most documented fraud cases her office has pursued in a decade. Olivia was quiet. 17 counts, she said, 17. She looked at her coffee. She was processing it the way you process news that you expected and still weren't entirely prepared to hear, not with shock, but with the particular weight of a thing becoming real. For months, she had been living inside the process of it. The recordings, the statements, the meetings with federal investigators, the divorce proceedings running parallel to the criminal case, the careful daily work of rebuilding her own life, while simultaneously watching the old one dismantle itself in courtrooms and federal offices. She had known this was coming. Knowing it was coming and hearing it said out loud in your father's kitchen were still two different things. The assault charge from the courtroom, her father continued, that proceeding is separate. His attorney filed a motion to plead to a lesser charge. The state's attorney rejected it. It's going to trial. Olivia looked up. He's fighting the assault charge. His new attorney is. Garrison Price withdrew from the case 2 weeks ago. Michael paused. Garrison filed a motion to withdraw citing irreconcilable differences with his client's directives, which in lawyer language means his client told him to do something he wasn't willing to do. What did Daniel tell him to do? Michael Carter looked at his daughter steadily. We don't know exactly, but given the trajectory of Daniel's decisions over the past 3 weeks, I think it's reasonable to assume it was something that would have required Garrison to be dishonest in a direction Garrison wasn't willing to go. Olivia nodded slowly. She thought about Garrison Price sitting on the courthouse steps after that phone call with Agent Hartwell. She had heard about that from Rachel, who had heard it from a court officer who had seen it happen. Garrison Price, who in 30 years of practice had never been seen to sit anywhere without choosing to, sitting on concrete courthouse steps because his legs had made the decision for him. She almost felt something for Garrison Price. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of recognition of what it looked like when a person finally encountered a limit they hadn't known they had. Rachel is coming this week to go over the divorce settlement terms, Olivia said. With the federal asset freeze, Daniel's negotiating position has changed considerably. I imagine it has, her father said. Rachel thinks we can get full dissolution of the marital estate structured to account for the 7 years of financial control he maintained over me. She also thinks, given the nature of the federal case, that the civil fraud exposure creates an additional pathway for compensation that... She stopped. She almost smiled. I sound like a lawyer. Her father did smile. You sound like my daughter. She looked at him. You always were the smartest person in any room you walked into, he said. Daniel just convinced you to stop walking into rooms. She held that for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. I'm thinking about going back to school, she said. Her father looked at her. Not law school, she added quickly. Counseling. I was always before Daniel. I was working toward a counseling degree. I had 2 years completed. Rachel found a program that will accept a transfer of credits. It would take another 2 years, maybe 2.5. She paused. I know that sounds... It sounds right, her father said. She looked at him. It always sounded right, he said. Even before. Even when you were 22 and telling me about it at this same table. It sounded exactly like what you were supposed to do with your life. She didn't answer immediately. She pressed her hands around the mug again and felt the warmth of it and sat in the kitchen where she had grown up and let that sentence, it always sounded right, settle into the part of her that had been told for 7 years that her dreams were childish, that her instincts were wrong, that the version of herself she had wanted to become before Daniel found her was insufficient, unworthy a thing to be quietly set aside. Okay, she said. Okay, I'm going back to school. Her father reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 3 weeks later, the divorce settlement was finalized. The proceeding was brief and quiet, which was the opposite of everything that had preceded it. Rachel had negotiated terms that reflected the full weight of what the evidence supported: financial compensation for 7 years of controlled isolation for the job. Olivia had lost because of a phone call Daniel had made for the assets she had been denied access to throughout the marriage, for the medical costs she had accumulated, seeing doctors about symptoms that were the direct result of living in a state of chronic fear. The federal asset freeze had complicated Daniel's liquidity, but his attorneys, the new ones, a less prominent firm that had taken the case on with clear eyes about what they were dealing with, had reached an agreement that gave Olivia financial stability without requiring her to wait years for the federal proceedings to conclude. Rachel called her after the last signature was placed. "It's done," she said. Olivia was sitting in her apartment, the same apartment. She had been looking for a new place but hadn't found the right one yet, and she had come to peace with the small room because it represented something, the first space that was entirely hers, where no one monitored what she wrote in a notebook or asked her to justify where she had been. "It's done," Olivia repeated. "How do you feel?" She thought about that genuinely for a moment. "Like I'm waiting to feel something bigger than I actually feel," she said. "Is that normal?" Rachel laughed. It was the first time Olivia had heard Rachel Morgan laugh in 4 months of working together, and it turned out she had an unexpectedly warm laugh, the kind that made the person hearing it feel like they were being let in on something. That is extremely normal. The big feelings come later. Right now, your nervous system is just trying to figure out that it's allowed to stop running. When does it figure that out? Different for everyone, but you'll know when it does. Something ordinary will happen, you'll make coffee or open a window or hear a song on the radio, and you'll realize your chest isn't tight, and that'll be the moment. Olivia looked at the wall of her apartment. "Thank you, Rachel," she said, "for everything." "Don't thank me," Rachel said. "You did the hard part. I just carried the briefcase." The federal trial of Daniel Whitmore began on a Tuesday morning in February, 4 months after the courtroom hearing that had cracked everything open. Olivia did not attend the opening day. She had been advised by the federal prosecutors that her presence was not required until she was called to testify, and Rachel had gently suggested that sitting in a courtroom, watching the opening arguments of a case built substantially on her own testimony, was not the most emotionally useful way to spend a Tuesday. Instead, she was in a classroom. She had enrolled in the counseling program the week before, the first day of the spring semester. She sat in a room full of people who were mostly younger than her, with a notebook open in front of her and a professor at the front of the room who was explaining the fundamental principle that made counseling work, which was that every person who sits across from you carries a story they have not fully been able to tell, and your job, your primary job, before technique and theory and clinical methodology, is to make them feel safe enough to tell it. Olivia wrote that down. She underlined it. She looked at what she had written and thought about Rachel Morgan sitting across a table in a coffee shop on the south side of the city saying, "Tell me everything starting from the very beginning and don't leave anything out, even the parts that make you look bad." She thought about what it had felt like to be asked that. She thought about how many people were sitting somewhere right now inside a life that was slowly erasing them, carrying a story they hadn't found anywhere safe enough to tell. She thought, this is the work. She had known it at 22. She knew it more completely now. The testimony came 6 weeks into the trial. Olivia walked into the federal courtroom on a Wednesday morning with Rachel beside her and her father somewhere in the building he had come. He had told her not in any official capacity, just as a person who wanted to be near his daughter on a difficult day, and he would wait in the hallway, and that was enough. She sat in the witness stand. She placed her hands in her lap. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Carla Mendez, approached and looked at Olivia with the calm directness of someone who had prepared her witness carefully and trusted what they had built together over the preceding weeks. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I'm going to ask you to take us through the years of your marriage to Daniel Whitmore with specific focus on what you observed, what you heard, and what you witnessed regarding his business activities. Take your time. Start wherever feels right." Olivia looked at the room. She looked at Daniel across the room. I was sitting at the defense table in a suit that was still good, but not the same caliber as the charcoal gray suit he had worn the day he struck her. That suit had been selected for a performance. This suit was what remained when the performance was no longer viable. He looked like a man who had aged considerably in 4 months. The particular kind of aging that happens not from time, but from the sustained effort of holding something together that is no longer holding. I was looking back at her. For 7 years she had looked away when he looked at her. She had learned in the way you learn things when your survival depends on learning them. That direct eye contact with Daniel was a form of challenge he responded to badly. She had learned to look slightly past him or down, or to find something else in the room to focus on. She looked directly at him now. He looked away first. She took a breath. She began to speak. The testimony lasted 2 days. She told them about the phone calls through closed doors, and the names on documents, and the dinners with investors, and the calendar entries, and Victor Hale and Castle Point Holdings, and the 2 in the morning conversation. She had stood in a hallway and absorbed and filed away in the one part of herself that Daniel had never managed to reach. She told the truth, every word of it. And the courtroom listened the way courtrooms listen, when what is being said is specific and detailed and corroborated. And the person saying it is someone who has clearly had to work very hard to be in this room and is doing it anyway. On the second day, Daniel's defense attorney cross-examined her for 3.5 hours. He was skilled. He looked for inconsistencies. He questioned her timeline. He suggested that her recollections had been shaped by the adversarial nature of the divorce proceedings. He implied carefully and without saying it directly that a woman who had filed for divorce and filed for a protective order and cooperated with a federal investigation had motivations that colored everything she was presenting as objective memory. Olivia answered every question. She did not get flustered. She did not get angry. She did not raise her voice or cry or hesitate in ways that suggested she was reconstructing rather than remembering. She answered the questions the way a person answers questions when they are telling the truth directly, without embellishment, without the slight over-precision of someone performing honesty rather than being honest. When the cross-examination was done, ADA Mendez stood for one redirect question. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "opposing counsel has suggested that your testimony has been shaped by the animosity of a contentious divorce. I want to ask you directly, is there anything you have told this court today that you have said because you want to harm Daniel Whitmore?" Olivia looked at the room. She said, "No. I'm here because $200 million belongs to people who trusted someone they shouldn't have trusted. And I was in the rooms where that happened, and staying quiet about it would have made me complicit in something I refuse to be complicit in." She paused. "I'm not here about my marriage. I'm here about the truth." Mendez nodded once. No further questions. The jury deliberated for 11 days. 11 days, during which Olivia went to class, went home, called her father every evening, and tried to live her life in the forward direction rather than the direction of watching and waiting. She was not always successful. There were mornings when the weight of the pending verdict made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. There were nights when she lay awake and thought about all the ways things could go wrong, all the ways, money and lawyers, and the particular machinery of doubt that good defense attorneys are trained to manufacture could still intervene between what was true and what was decided. Rachel called on the 11th night. "How are you?" she asked. "Honest answer," Olivia said. "Always." "I'm terrified," Olivia said. "Not of him anymore, of the verdict, of the possibility that all of it, all the testimony, all the recordings, 2 years of federal investigation. I'm terrified it won't be enough." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Please. I have watched a lot of women do what you did in that courtroom last week. I have been doing this for 9 years, and I have sat beside a lot of clients in a lot of witness stands. And I want you to understand something very clearly. She paused. "What you did in there, the way you held yourself, the way you answered, the way you looked at that man and spoke the truth about him without flinching, I have never seen anything like it. Whatever the jury decides, you have already done something that does not depend on their verdict." Olivia was quiet. "You spoke," Rachel said. "For 7 years he took your voice. You got it back. That is not a verdict. That is not a verdict. That belongs to you, regardless of what 12 people decide tomorrow." The verdict came the next morning. Guilty. On 14 of the 17 counts, wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, the 3 counts that did not result in conviction were technical charges related to specific transfer mechanisms that the defense had successfully argued lacked sufficient direct evidence. 14 counts. Olivia was sitting in her apartment when Rachel called her with the news. She had not been in the courtroom. She had chosen not to be. She was sitting at the small table by the window with a cup of coffee and a textbook open in front of her, a chapter on trauma-informed counseling approaches, and her phone rang, and Rachel's voice said the word guilty, and the textbook went slightly out of focus. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She breathed. She did not feel triumphant. She had known coming out of her testimony that triumph was not the right word for what this was. Triumph implied a competition, and she had not been competing with Daniel. She had been trying to tell the truth loudly enough that it couldn't be ignored. Triumph was Daniel's word. Daniel's framework, the thing you felt when you believed life was about winning and losing. What she felt was something different, something quieter, something that felt like a room after a long storm when the noise has finally stopped and you realize you are still standing. "Thank you," she said to Rachel. Her voice was steady. "Don't thank me," Rachel said, for the second time. I know," Olivia said. "You just carried the briefcase." A pause. Then Rachel laughed again, that warm, unexpected laugh. "Call your dad," she said. He answered before the first ring finished. "I heard," he said. His voice was different from his court voice, and different from his careful voice, and different from every version of his voice she had heard in the past 4 months. It was simply his voice, her father's voice, the voice that had read to her when she was 6 and told her she could be anything when she was 12, and warned her about Daniel when she was 23, and said, "I'm proud of you" on a phone call 3 months ago. "Dad," she said. "Yeah," he said. Just that. Just yeah the way a father says yeah when his daughter calls him and he has been waiting by the phone, and the news is the right news and the word carries everything. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 4 months later. Daniel's attorneys indicated they would argue for leniency given certain cooperative disclosures he had made in the final weeks of the trial. The federal prosecutors indicated they would argue for the maximum. The process would take time, as it always did, the law moving at the pace it moved, deliberate and slow and indifferent to anyone's urgency. Olivia did not attend the sentencing. She was in class. She found out afterward from Rachel, 22 years in federal prison, ineligible for parole consideration for the first 14. She read the text while sitting in her car before driving home. 22 years. She set the phone on the passenger seat. She thought about a man she had met at 23 who had offered her a life and delivered a cage. She thought about 7 years of having herself systematically removed piece by piece with such patience and precision that she hadn't fully understood what was happening until almost too late. She thought about the night she left the 2 bags on the floor of an empty apartment, the shaking hands. She picked the phone back up and typed a message to Rachel. It said, "I heard. I'm okay. Are you free for coffee this week?" Rachel replied in under a minute. "Always. You pick the place." She put the car in drive. 8 months after the federal verdict, Olivia Carter, she had taken her name back in the divorce, taken it back with the particular intentionality of someone who understood that a name is not a small thing, opened the doors of a nonprofit she had spent 7 months building while finishing her coursework. She called it Find Your Voice. It was not a large organization. It had 4 staff members, a small office, and a partnership with 2 local hospitals and a community legal aid clinic. It offered counseling services, legal referrals, safety planning, and a peer support program that connected women who were currently inside controlling relationships with women who had made it out. The peer support program was Rachel's idea. The most powerful thing Rachel had said over coffee 6 months earlier is not a lawyer, it's not a judge, it's not even a federal investigation. The most powerful thing is a woman who has been where you are sitting across from you and saying, "I got out. I know it doesn't look like there's a way. I'm telling you there is." Olivia had written that down. She had written it on the first page of the notebook she kept for Find Your Voice, the same notebook as she filled over the following months with plans and partnerships and funding applications and all the detailed, unglamorous, necessary work of building something real. The day the organization opened, her father came. He stood in the doorway of the small office and looked around at the 4 staff members at the folding chairs, arranged in a circle for the first support group session that afternoon at the wall, where someone had painted in clean, simple letters the name of the organization, and beneath it a line Olivia had chosen herself. The line read, "You were never nothing." Michael Carter stood in the doorway and read that line. He pressed his lips together. He crossed the room to where his daughter was standing and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together looking at what she had built out of the wreckage of 7 years and the long, patient courage of a woman who had kept everything inside her that mattered most. "Your mother would have loved this," he said. Olivia leaned into him briefly. "I know," she said. The first client who walked through the door of Find Your Voice that afternoon was a woman in her mid-30s. She came alone. She sat in the chair across from Olivia, and she folded her hands in her lap, the way Olivia had folded her hands in a coffee shop on the south side of the city, the day she sat across from Rachel Morgan and didn't know yet if she could trust anyone. Olivia looked at her. She said, "Tell me everything. Start wherever feels right. Don't leave anything out, even the parts that make you look bad. I can only help you if I understand the full picture." The woman looked at her. Something in her face shifted. The way something shifts when a person who has been bracing for judgment finds compassion instead. She began to speak, and Olivia Carter listened with everything she had, with the attention of a woman who understood from the inside what it cost to sit in that chair, with the patience of someone who knew that the most important thing she could offer was not advice or strategy or even the story of her own survival, but simply this, the willingness to hear the whole truth without flinching. Daniel Whitmore had spent 7 years trying to take her voice. He had succeeded only in teaching her exactly how much a voice was worth. And in a small office in Chicago, with folding chairs arranged in a circle and a line painted on the wall, and a woman sitting across from her who was only at the very beginning of finding her way back to herself, Olivia Carter had become exactly who she was always supposed to be. Not the role someone created for her, not the possession someone believed they owned, not the silence someone thought they had purchased forever. A woman who had survived the erasure, a woman who had kept the truth alive inside herself when everything else was being taken. A woman who had walked into a courtroom with 47 recordings and walked out with her name, her voice, and her father. And a woman who understood now with the clarity that only comes from having lost everything and found your way back to what was real, that the people who try to own you are always afraid of exactly one thing. The moment you stop being afraid of them, that moment had come, and it had changed everything.